Folks, I have to speak in English. My Spanish is so bad. So thank you for bearing with me, and I'm afraid that applies to my friends on the stage too, whose first language is not Spanish. So please bear with us, use the translation devices. We have some fantastic translators, and give a big clap to the translators. They are amazing, this particular group. You've heard, the CEO of the Climate Bonds Initiative. I've got on this really cool panel where we're going to be looking at the investor view. I've got Ashley Schulten here from BlackRock. She's the Managing Director, Head of Responsible Investment for Global Fixed Income. Now, you know how much global fixed income BlackRock has, don't you? Like, we're talking trillions here, so it's a really fairly big role. Let's just call her Miss Trillion for the day. And on this side, I have Alya Kayan, who's from Affirmative Investment Management, which is an extremely interesting specialist boutique, which has got a fantastic deal of Lombard Odier and others. They've got billions they're managing, and they're focused on sustainable in a really deep way. Alya is a partner of Verifications and Impact, and we'll tell you a little bit more a little bit later. And at the end, I've got Bruno Bastit from Standards & Poor's. Now, why he's here is because Standards & Poor's have been through a revolution in the last few years, as have their colleagues at Moody's and so on. He's a senior corporate governance and sustainable finance specialist, which is something that did not exist in Standards & Poor's a few years ago. They are now looking at how to bring in metrics that we know are important for the future of our children into credit ratings. And he'll talk a little bit about that. I'm going to give you a bit of a context for this conversation first, if you'll indulge me for a few minutes. You kind of know the headlines. You saw some earlier slides. We've got a bond market, a green and sustainable bond market that is going crazy. 258 billion roughly issuance last year in US dollars. 50% growth in the previous year. It's going to be 50% plus growth this year. The fastest growing asset class on the planet. It's very exciting. It's fizzing. Very exciting. Of course, it's not big enough. But hey, we're getting there. We've seen all sorts of issuance. Last year, we see a really strong growth in sovereign green bonds. We saw everyone from Nigeria to Netherlands issue bonds that went like hotcakes at a market fair. Honestly, they are so popular with investors. It's amazing. There is a story behind this. It's a story of risk. And it's a story of trying to figure out what to do about the risk. The risk that is most potent, not the only one, but the risk that is most potent is the risk of climate change. This is a risk, well, let me put it this way. At the moment, we are heading to the worst possible trajectory of climate as talked about in the 1990s. The worst possible trajectory. We have failed so unbelievably and utterly as a global community to make significant progress on climate change. Emissions in the last 30 years globally, well, we've put in more emissions in the last 30 years than in the previous 100 years. And that's why we've been talking at the climate change conferences. We are heading now for a world of utter catastrophe for our children. A world of 4 to 6 to possibly 8 degrees Celsius warming in the next century. 2 meters sea level rises is pretty well baked in. There goes waterfront and Cartagena. Get out while you can, folks. Buy something a bit behind. But the worst thing is the other things that flow on from this, which is the changes to agricultural zones. Maize will no longer be grown in places that used to be grown. It'll have to find new places. It may cease. We see in Europe the extinction underway right now of the humble bumblebee that used to be in the children's books when I was a kid. It's disappearing in front of our very eyes, the climate scientists are saying, because of changed climate, which is going to have a flow-on effect for plants and crops and so on. We will see a century at this stage of famine, of war, of pestilence. Wuhan is just the beginning of what will be 111. The climate scientists I speak to are depressed. We have an epidemic of depression amongst climate scientists. They believe that there is a very high probability that we will lose a third to a half of the world's population this century. which, by the way, we did in the 1600s, when temperatures went down 2 degrees. Oddly enough, we now know the reason why we had a global climate crisis in the 1600s, a century of war, pestilence, and famine, where we lost a third of the world's population in that 100-year period, was because of the Americas. Because in the 1500s, we had so much smallpox and measles infection that we killed off 90% of people in the Americas. The forest regrowth in the Amazon, in Colombia, in Central America was so great, it sucked carbon out of the atmosphere. We can see this now in the carbon records. And it cooled the planet. Of course, there's a slightly positive twist in that too. If we can only grow those forests again, thank you, President, with your tree planting scheme, do more of that, we might be able to suck a lot of carbon out of the atmosphere. But so far, we're not doing very well. So that's where we're going. Now, from a portfolio manager, that's bad for the kids, but it's also bad for their portfolios. In the Institute of Actuaries, 3 years ago, they published a report on the forward risks of climate change. And they said that they believe there is going to be wholesale portfolio decimation in institutional investment portfolios by 2050 if we continue to go on the road that we are now on climate change. Now, what that means is Grupo Sura will be bankrupt because of the extreme volatility we're going to experience and the flow-on effect. Now, we're risk people in this room. Nothing's certain. This is just a high probability risk, and the actuaries and insurance companies and pension funds are getting anxious because they don't know whether they're going to be able to match their assets and liabilities in 20 years and 30 years and 40 years out. What do they do? How do they shift this? It's very difficult to change your portfolio to be able to deal with those kinds of risks because these are massive global risks. And then comes the green bond. So what's the green bond? It's simply an instrument. It's very, very simple. Anyone can issue a green bond or green debt. It addresses a long-term risk by investing the right kind of things, but it fits perfectly in a short-term 5-year modern portfolio management strategy. Simple, simple, simple. So all it is like you go to your uncle and borrow money to buy a car, and he says, yeah, that's great, but can you buy an electric? Because I think that's going to be better for the planet. All right. You're still paying back the money to him. It's a standard loan. All you're doing is promising to use it for something, in this case, green. Anyone can do this, and that's why it's working. So we've seen this incredible rapid growth of a market in areas that are part of our solution. Of course, behind this, we know what the solutions are. We've got to do for climate change, clean energy, clean transport. Thank you, City of Bogota and FTN, for the electric bus purchase that's underway at the moment. Hoorah! More of that. We need to be changing our cities to have energy-efficient buildings. We need to be shifting agriculture to be able to look at low mitigation crops, carbon sequestration. Quinoa, fantastic for putting carbon in the soil. Maize, not so good. We need to change what we're going to eat. We need to think about resilience. How do we protect about the extremes of weather that are going to happen come what may now? The bushfires in Australia where I was at Christmas, just the beginning. That's going to happen again and again. We've already lost that battle. We need to invest about $90 trillion globally between now and 2050 to make the transition to a kind of world we want our kids to be able to live in. A low carbon, climate resilient, green, sustainable world. 90 trillion. That is the biggest investment splurge in the history of humankind if we do it. I mean, remember, if we don't do it, catastrophe. The International Panel of Climate Change says we have 10 years. We'll know in 10 years what kind of future we've got, our kids have got. We have an unusual period of history where we can see to a reasonable degree of certainty what the future holds. We've never had this before. We can use this to chart the right kind of direction going forward. And we have something going for us, something that makes me think, in the face of this potential catastrophe, we are somehow lucky. We are lucky because at this point of history, when we're facing disaster, yet we know what to do, the kinds of investments we have to make, we have the money. We have capital. We have more capital on the planet now than ever before in the history of humanity. We have capital sitting in useless places like German bunds, where they force you to pay them to take their money. 21% of the institutional investment in the European Union is sitting in zero and negative interest rate bonds. Ay, es estúpido. Like, how are they going to pay my pension? No way whatsoever. They need yield. They need places to put their money, and they want to go green because they're worried about the long term. And that's the opportunity for us in this room now. The capital's out there. It needs yield. It needs places to go. It wants to invest in a future for the kids as well as their portfolios. It needs the deals created, guys. So Bank Coldex, great what you've done. I'm really thrilled to be here, but you haven't done enough. Every bond coming out of Bank Coldex should be a green and sustainable bond. And FDN, where are you in the room? Let alone Bank of Bogota and others. We owe it to our children to do something like that, and we have the opportunity to do something about it. I'm going to now ask some of our friends around the table a little bit more about this. Am I right? Am I mad? Ashley, am I over the top here? Am I crazy talking about the nature of investor appetite for green, for sustainable? I mean, your own CEO has put out a letter recently being interviewed about this. Is that just bullshit marketing, or is there something, what's going on here?
Sean, you've known me long enough. That's not marketing. So maybe it would be helpful to give the audience some context around BlackRock's involvement in the space, how we think about this as a large institutional investor, and I think what is working for us around green bonds and why this is an instrument that we think has some even further potential. And I think for a lot of institutional asset managers or institutional asset owners, this journey around this topic of sustainability really started with the idea that our foremost role has been to be a fiduciary. And so we're entrusted with clients' assets to manage them and safeguard them for the amount of time that we're given to do that. And so there's an acknowledgement that the tools that we used 5 years ago to think about credit risk in portfolios are not the same tools that we use today. So society is changing, and we could argue that we're even going through a sustainability revolution, if you will. And so we need new sources of data. We need to think about the world differently. We need to think about consumer sentiment around sustainability topics. We need to think about the fact that Paris actually happened. And so was that a joke? Or is there really going to be some movement around Paris? Because if there is, and we actually are trying to get carbon neutral by 2050, that means drastic changes to our energy mix today. And so what does that mean for valuations in portfolios, and how are we preparing for that? And so I think traditionally, the way we've been thinking about this is really from the risk on our portfolios from these things. And so what's the impact of my portfolios from climate change? Is it a Paris risk, or is it now something where the types of things Sean was mentioning, I might have 30-year munis. And so what's happening to sea level rise in the municipality that I'm invested in? What's happening to that building that's on the coast in terms of wind speeds for hurricanes in a forward state? How do I metric that, and how to make sure that I'm insuring against that? So I think that's the traditional way of thinking about it, risk on the portfolios. And I think there has been a part of the investor base, which I would say traditionally was in the place of endowments or maybe family office, or we'll call them the do-gooders. You know, people like, Sean, they care about what their investments mean for their children's future. I think that historically has not been the place where institutional money has really focused on. And so that investor had been thinking about, yes, the impact on my portfolio, but what's the impact of my portfolio on the world? And so what I think you're seeing happen is this acknowledgement, especially around climate, that if we don't do something with our investments now around climate change, that we are not going to have the four types of GDP that we need as long-term investors to make those fiduciary needs met for clients. So if the climatologists are right and we're looking at negative GDP on a forward space in certain jurisdictions in the world, and we're looking at this cataclysmic type change unless we go down Paris, then we think about future-proofing our investments now with the impact of. And so what you see, and especially from earlier on the insurance community, that's a typical type of investor that naturally is concerned about climate change. And so some sort of investment in their traditional portfolio that also gives them the benefit of having positive impact makes perfect sense for them. And so about 5 years ago, we started working on this concept of a green bonds. I think that we probably didn't even believe in our wildest dreams we'd be here where we are today with over 500 billion outstanding. This is something that has gained regulatory support globally from many different areas. It's something that has, I would say, pretty consistent universal market standards of what is green and what is not. There are some outliers of bonds that everybody can disagree on, but for the most part, this is converging sort of an ideal sort of green type investment. And why this works for many of the BlackRock investors, and we are a big asset manager, and we manage about half of our money is in fixed income, and you think about this as public markets fixed income. This is investment grade, public market securities that have CUSIPs and daily liquidities and credit ratings and fit within a traditional fixed income allocation. And green bonds fit that. The green bond is something from a company that I probably have already done the credit research on, that I can trade on a daily basis, that I can fit within my traditional allocation in terms of an instrument that's digestible. And so it's been a great fit for portfolios that maybe they want to invest in a green way, but they're not going to change their asset allocation mix from 2% infra to 10% infra. It just doesn't work for them. And so, at BlackRock, we've had a lot of success with this. We've launched a number of funds around green bonds, green bond onlys, and green bond part of the index portfolios. And we've been able to do some really interesting things in the green bond space. Someone earlier had up a slide of the impact of some of the projects that went in green and social bonds. We're able now to take a combination of a number of different green bonds that we think about buying and create a total portfolio impact. And so you can say per dollar invested, then what was my green impact? How many gallons of water did I save? How many hectares of forest did I save with this investment? And in that way, we can sort of compare green versus green. I think what we're driving to in the green bond space, I hope, is some sort of regulatory support, which would enable companies to fund green projects at a better level than their non-green projects. And the result of that, then, is to change the way companies allocate capital and to get them to fund more green projects if we can make it easier for them.
So we've seen in Europe the Hungarian central bank bring in risk weighting differential for green bonds, the capital ratio requirements of banks. That would be nice regulator in Colombia if you're in the room. We've seen the Chinese regulator provide, if your bank posting green bonds at the liquidity lending window, you get a 1% discount on your capital. Now that would be very nice for some of the banks here as well. But you've also seen on the asset purchasing side, you've seen the Bank of International Settlements set up this green bond fund and so on. How important do you think that sort of signaling device to central banks? We've seen a lot of banks.
I think that those types of things, and even having sovereign issuances, I mean, I'm always encouraging sovereigns to issue green bonds for a couple reasons. Number one, if I'm trying to recreate a typical type global ag mandate, I need green bonds in all sectors. So I need securitized, I need credit, I need sovereigns, so I need more sovereign green bonds. But I also think it's a very powerful signaling mechanism to lend some credibility to the space, to say these are the types of issuers that have deemed this structure something valid. And I think those types of efforts are reinforcing to investors.
Okay, so we've got a lot happening. Alya, in your experience from AIM, you've been striking these deals with things like private banks in Switzerland. I mean, what are they actually asking for? How does this how's this going in terms of the nature of appetite? What are they looking for? Because I realize that's translating into the work you do, which is the screening tools you use for investment fund. Tell us about your clients first.
Sure. Thank you, Sean. So I think I'll give you a little bit of a sort of a different approach. AIM is started in 2014 as a real dedicated, pure play, fixed income impact investment firm. Although we started in 2014, really many of our colleagues really come with years of experience in the fixed income green bond space. My colleague, for example, Judith Moore, really created the template for the first green bond at the World Bank. And Stuart Kinnersley also started the first, was part of the first green bond fund. So we're bringing that experience in really focusing on very sort of deep analysis and deep commitment to impact investing. To answer what Sean has asked about clients. So we have clients all over the world, institutional investor in Australia, retail investors in Australia, Lombard ODAs, Sean mentioned earlier, in Switzerland, and in the US, ultra-high net worth families, foundations, and so forth. So really run the gamut of clients in terms of what they're all looking for. So what are they all looking for? Sustainability is really the 21st century imperative. Nothing that we do does not touch sustainability, and all actors really have to play a role. And we were talking about this earlier, where we're talking about, yes, this is green bond, sustainable finance, but we're really talking about also policy and corporate side as well. So really we're looking at all of these players coming in to really make a difference. So some of the essential things to look at in terms of what clients want is, how can we make a difference, make a positive difference in both environmental and social impact without compromising returns, or at the very least generating mainstream returns. That is the absolute basis for us. And we're also looking at mainstream benchmarks. So this is not, I know there has been a lot of myth in the past about, compromising returns, and those are really all myths. I mean, there's enough evidence now, enough studies now to demonstrate that you are not compromising returns. And so how do you do that both? How can you play a part in sustainable finance and addressing climate change and addressing the real imperative, as Sean eloquently said, the real imperative issue for all of our lives going forward. And at the same time, we're able to generate mainstream returns and be able to also look at fiduciary issues. So be able to look at risk and so on. So clients are all over the map in terms of the types of clients that we have seen coming to us, and there's all kinds of motivations. The number one motivation has been client demand, but there are motivations such as those who just want to align their mission with environmental and social and governance issues. And sustainability. So there's a whole lot of flexibility there, but I would say that there's been a major growth. I started in this business in 1994 when I used to work with Calvert Investments at the time, and those were the days, believe me, we didn't even have the internet. We were doing research a different way. But we've come a very long way, and there's really no excuse anymore for anyone to just sort of sit back and say, well, we'll let the investors deal with it, or we'll let the policy people deal with it, or we'll let the corporates deal with it. We all really have to come together, and we all play a part. So that's my challenge to you.
And what does this mean for how you screen bonds? I mean, you're one of the tougher players in the market in terms of your tight criteria. But let's say we get a corporation in Midian who wants to come and what are you going to say?
What's the process we go through? Yeah. So I'll give you a very quick top-down view of our process. There's really 3 steps. First step is sustainability verification and credit. So those goes together. We call it verification, but it's looking at sustainability process and criteria and the credit, and we work very closely. In fact, we sit at the same table. So that's a note. Credit and sustainability go together. What are the factors we're looking at? We're looking at not just the use of proceeds, which you'll hear about today, but also the responsibility of the issuer. Is the issuer aligned with their use of proceeds? Is there any kind of strategic mandate? Is there a transition plan? What is the pathway? So we're really looking at that. We're looking at transparency. Transparency and disclosure is key for us. So it's not enough to say just what the project will be, but we need to see some materials on that. And then we're also looking at the material impact. So we're looking at impact reporting. So we're looking at verification. We build the universe from there. We build a universe from which the portfolio managers can then select their securities depending on the mandate. and then we also do impact reporting. Throughout all of the three processes, engagement is key, so I would really urge you, for those who are looking to issue, to make sure that you are also engaging with your investors and that you have that aspect ready.
Thank you. So Alya will be taking cues afterwards. If you've got a deal to offer, as will Ashley, please make sure you grab them at the coffee afterwards. We're hoping there'll be a lot. Bruno, Standards & Poor's. Well, they had a little bit of a problem in 2007, 2009, as you know, in terms of their methodologies. They've been working hard to do better since then. And Bruno's at the forefront of a whole different approach going on in S&P and some of your sister firms, which is to start looking much more deeply about the kind of risks, including around climate. Tell us how far you've gone down this trail, and is it working? And what are you actually doing, so we know how we can pitch to you later?
Thanks, Sean. So you're right to say that a lot has been happening in the last couple of years at S&P, on the rating side as well as in our sister companies in indices and market intelligence. I sit within the ratings practice. So we created a sustainable finance team about a year and a half ago to very much shore up capacity and capability within S&P. So you can imagine, as a credit rating agency, people have been doing the same thing for pretty much 100 years or so. So to move things from inside the house is pretty challenging. But we've seen a significant and tremendous interest internally, but also externally in the work that we're doing. Our team is a team of give or take 15 people that has been growing from one person 1.5 years ago to 15 now. We're expected to be 25 people by the end of the year, located between Paris, London, Sao Paulo, Mexico, Singapore. So it's very much taking up internally quite significantly. Now, what is it that we do? First of all, the main thing, our bread and butter, credit ratings, which is really just analyzing the capability and the ability of a firm, company, government to repay its debt in full and on time. But you do that better to improve and enhance our analysis. We've been refining what are the key environmental, social, and governance metrics that impact the ability to repay that debt. So we spent a significant amount of time in the last year to define those lists, those key KPIs and indicators. We published this week, actually, sector scorecards. 21 sectors already. We're going to go up to 61, defining very clearly what are the ESG elements that are material for us from a credit perspective. Now, that's sometimes a bit limited, as it's only within a credit lens, if you will. So we've also developed different other methodologies to analyze ESG. One is what we call an ESG evaluation, which looks at an issuer from the top in the way they consider ESG, from the board down to the operational level, and the way they will prepare the entity for the future. That's one. More on topic for what we've been talking about today on green bonds, we've developed a methodology to assess essentially the greenness, if you will, of bonds, looking at use of proceeds, obviously, looking at mitigation projects as well as adaptation and resilience projects. So we've been expanding the types of sectors and projects we've been looking at, most recently developing agricultural modules and forestry modules, which have been particularly of interest to South American clients, particularly in Brazil. This has been taking up quite a lot within S&P.
You've done quite a lot of work on the agriculture side, but I want to ask you about something else. We talked a lot about policy transitions. Ashley alluded to it earlier. And one of the big policy impacts of climate, which people may not realize, is that in 2000s, Germany decided to bring a feed-in tariff. The volume purchasing of solar, thanks to German policy decision, drove down the price. And then when China took up the same job in 2005, 2010, massive volume purchasing of solar drove down the price. We are getting, in Colombia, really cheap solar prices now in the latest auction because of what the policies of the German and the Chinese government, right? That's an example of policy transition hitting us. And now we have coal companies and gas companies, other sorts of companies suffering as a result, predicting the future. I'll give you another example. China has decided to become an electric vehicle champion for the world. They've told all the car companies in China, you will not invest in petrol. Niente, niente. They're only investing in electric vehicles. The price in China is going like this. Now, that means that in 2 to 3 years, you'll be buying electric vehicles here. They're cheaper on OPEX already, and they're cheaper on CAPEX. And the range is going to be fantastic. That's how you will experience a policy driver, a transition policy of a government. Now, we're going to get a lot of these. We're getting this a little hint of this of steel, where Sweden has pushed their steel company to bring zero carbon steel to market. 2026, they announced last week. It's going to happen. Way ahead of the Chinese and the Japanese. Now, what's that going to do to the steel market, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? How are you tackling that? Like, we have a world of turmoil because governments are taking action. The EU has now got incredibly tough targets and a Green Deal and so on. What are you going to say about companies that could be exposed badly to that policy transition risk? Can you pick that up? Have you got a methodology?
We do up to a point, and again, there's elements that are different in terms of the impact on the credit risk and the credit rating of a company, but others are more long-term and focusing on how an entity could be impacted by those policies. One element that we haven't necessarily talked about, and I think that's quite crucial here, is the transparency and data and information, and how entities, may they be government, may they be companies, are communicating to the market and explaining impacts either from a risk perspective or an opportunity perspective. And again, as a rating agency, the only thing we are is an intermediate. So we help issuers explain to the market about the quality of their debt, if you will, and we help investors understand what issuers are effectively selling. So the more information that we have, the clarity that we have coming from issuers, again, regardless of what type of issuer they are, helps us to do our work better, our research better, and make the analytical work of the investment community a lot easier as well by saying, look, if a new regulation comes into play, may it be like the EU taxonomy, for instance, that is being developed, or the steel example that you're using, it will impact our business positively in such and such a way in the next 5, 10, 15 years. However, we could gain from it. There will be opportunities as well, maybe in other markets through our supply chain.
That's a very good point. I've in fact just come from a meeting of the EU Taxonomy Working Group in Brussels where we've bedded it down, finalised it. And this will be a procurement plan for the future. If you want a sense of where the market's going, have a look at the European Union Taxonomy when it gets published on the 9th of March, because it's the blueprint for what Europe's going to invest in and take forward. And there's something I need to share with you, a little inkling about that. Ashley and I were talking about it before. 2 years ago, the IPCC, the International Panel on Climate Change, and the International Energy Agency told us something which shocked us. That the models, what we have to do to reduce climate, address climate, I should say, and reduce emissions, now show we've got to reduce emissions 50% in 10 years. This is very, very difficult. As a result, the executive director of the International Energy Agency said there can be no more new fossil fuel investments unless they have carbon capture and sequestration to qualify. That was not what was said the year before. So in the European taxonomy, what you can call sustainable or green is now set at a tough emissions threshold. We don't exclude gas, but we say it's 100 grams of CO2 per kilowatt hour. That means gas without carbon capture and sequestration can now no longer be called sustainable. This is a shock. This is a shock for the government of Kazakhstan, who I advise. It's a gas economy. The government of Israel, that's got a 10-year plan to invest in gas as their climate strategy. And a shock for companies here, of course. There's a few things like that are worth looking at. On the other hand, there's vast new areas of investment that haven't been thought about, like grids and so on. So that is a guide to what the future looks like and a guide to areas that may be impacted by policy transition, because Europe is going fast now. Under the new regime, the new Green Deal, the various action plan on sustainable finance, you will see a lot of pressure to shift, and that's going to flow on to demand for green bonds. To wrap up, I want to see if there's any questions. I'm going to take about 3 questions from the audience. This is your chance to ask these folks a question. Very, very difficult to get, Ashley. Almost impossible. So 30 seconds of time. Can I get 3 volunteers, please, to ask a question? I've got one over there, microphone over there, please. I need a microphone fast to that person. Do I have a second volunteer? There, please, microphone to that person in the back row, and a third volunteer. Otherwise, I'll have to ask the CEO of Bank Coldex. He's gone. Please, 30 seconds, ask a question.
Good afternoon. My name is Juan Pablo Romero. I work at the Nature Conservancy Colombia, and I had a question for either one of you. How do you see investments in green infrastructure that are not related necessarily to climate change? For example, water security. That's the question.
Which is still climate change. Good question. Thank you. Next question. Need a microphone, please. Throw it over to him, fast. Tiempo corte, is that the right term?
Thanks, John. Eduardo Tortuga from PRI. Actually, I want to ask you, I know that it's very hard to have you here, so thanks for being in Colombia. My question is for you. Since the letter of your CIO, how things are changing, how you are perceiving, more interest on ESG.
Okay, I need one more question. Please.
It's a question for all of you. So when we do green bonds in Latin America, they're not investment grade, okay? And then the problem I have with investment banks is that they say, no, let's do a bond. Let's not do green bonds because emerging markets people will buy bonds and green bond people will only buy investment grades. Please tell me it's not true. Please tell them it's not true. I don't know. What's your take on that?
Any last questions before I go? Oh, one more.
Clemente del Valle, the head of Sustainable Finance Center in Los Andes. Now my question to the three of you is, a lot of the green finance that is coming out of green bonds, at least in Latin America primarily, is all going to renewables. Very little going to other areas of where you could have potential impact, whether it's land use, water management. I mean, there are plenty of areas, circular economy. That's not happening. I mean, do you have any thoughts, ideas of what we can do to expand this so we move away on, we just don't stick only to renewables because there's plenty of areas to work?
Okay, who'd like to start off? Ashley, Alya?
So I'll just address, I think these are kind of the same question here. For sure, in the green bond principles, where we outline use of proceeds, it doesn't necessarily have to be about mitigation. There's lots of things around biodiversity that we look at that are considered green. So the definition that we're looking for is if there is significant environmental benefit. And so there's lots of things that we fund in the green bond space that are not around renewable infrastructure. And I think that maybe we've seen a lot, I think probably most of the proceeds we see in green bonds so far are around renewable infrastructure and also energy efficiency. Those have been quicker, but it doesn't mean that they have to be. And I think this idea of pricing natural capital, right? It's like this next holy grail that we all want to get to. It's a little bit next gen, but certainly we support that.
Yes, just to echo that, at AIM we have at least 16 identified sectors. Those are approved sectors for our investments. So certainly renewable energy is not the only sector that we're looking at in terms of approvals. So yeah, and in terms of I think a related question as to how you can go beyond that, right? Because I think that's exactly the question we need to ask. We need to look at circular economy. We need to look beyond just, I mean, of course renewables is something that we must continue with, but there's just a lot more that needs to be included, particularly in emerging markets. Everywhere really, but I think particularly in the emerging markets. So, we've been looking at marine issues, sustainable, we've looked at fisheries, so there are many sectors that I would not just say this is all about renewable energy solely.
Yeah, I think a blue bond is a green bond. It is a green bond.
Yeah, exactly.
There are many names people use for marketing.
Blue,
There's blue,
right.
green, of course. Bank Coldex is an orange bond, which is a slightly different one. But in this area, we treat them all the same if they're addressing environmental challenges. You will see transition bonds in the news a lot now. Now we're going to say, transition to what? Of course, transition to the Paris Agreement, transition to future, but they're complicated. So if a gas company does a green bond to finance renewables, they might call it a transition bond because investors don't like calling a gas company green. I don't care. What we care about is where the money's going. We don't care who the issue is. So, Ecopetrol, come to the market. Do a green bond. Do a renewable energy green bond. We want you, we want you. And there'll be enthusiasm everywhere for this, because we want, above all, what we want is a lot more investment in the right kinds of investments. And that means water too. Little story. 2 utilities in Chile. They came to market with green bonds before the Chilean government done. They had fantastic response. They issued in pesos. They got an 8 basis point better price based on the strength of demand they got. Water utilities. Why haven't we seen a Colombian water utility? This should be easy, right? Sir, make it happen. Bruno, sorry. Go ahead.
I think you all make very good points. And to the question that was here, we would consider water as a core theme of the core topic that we analyze as well as part of the green bond evaluation that we do. In terms of why we only see renewables or utilities-focused project, it's been true around the world, and it's been true in LATAM in particular. But I think it's the same as any sector of industry. It's just encouraging people to be creative enough to develop new products and new themes. And I think if you turn up to London or New York and you have a biodiversity-focused product particularly dedicated to the Amazon, I think it would excite people a lot. It's just that we don't hear about it. So again, I would encourage everybody here to be creative, to be innovative in the topics that they want to work on, not just renewables. Ultimately, what we want is, as you adequately said, is the mission of the product clear? Is it a clear way to measure it and to verify the impact and how the work is happening? But apart from that, really the sky is the limit in terms of what can be done.
Yeah, mass transportation, and another big area, as you had just mentioned, for Bogota.
We're going to see a lot of green bonds out of electric transport in Colombia, right? Mm-hmm. Thank you. We need a lot of that sort of stuff. We need energy bonds. We need green building bonds, very energy efficient buildings. We need water bonds. We need sustainable agriculture bonds going forward. And there have already been many examples of all of these things in the market you could go into. The whole economy has to be transformed. This is not a small task. This is a task that will reach into every corner of the economy. We will need to be looking at resilience. How do we protect our coastal towns? How do we save the part of Cartagena that we're not going to let fall into the sea? Okay, the Hilton on the foreshore, that's going into the water, that's gone. But the rest of the town has to be protected, and that'll be a resilience investment. And we can make that a bond. And we've already seen bonds. The Dutch government put out a 6 billion euro resilience green bond to finance coastal protection for flood and storm surge. So we can do that sort of thing. We can be looking at how we harden infrastructure to heat waves. In Australia, where I came from a few years ago, the railway lines buckled in weeks of 50 degrees Celsius heat. They had to replace all that steel. Great business for steel, by the way. But they can issue a bond to do that replacement. It can be green, but it can also be a resilience bond. There's a lot to be done here. It will be every corner of the economy. And the job of the banks in the room and the development banks is to start understanding that and sharing that message around, and then ensuring that everyone understands. And then, in Colombia, translating that into lower cost capital for the people who will be most impacted, who have to act, the people who are on the panel before us. Because they're the ones who are going to have to deal with this on the ground. They're the ones who, unless they can get access to the right kinds of support, will have a very difficult time. That's what we're on about. We are over time. We need to finish up. Final comments, Bruno. Where is this going? Does S&P see this as an unstoppable movement or a complicated movement? How enthusiastic are you?
Both, actually. We just came up with a report with our expectation for next year. We're extremely optimistic about what's happening globally in terms of emissions of green or sustainability-related bonds. So I think it's going to be a place to watch. But again, it depends on all of you. It depends on anyone in this room, in this country, in other countries as well, both in EM and DM. So very much looking forward to what 2020 brings.
So I would just say that, I think that there's an acknowledgement that climate risk is investment risk. And to the question about BlackRock is that this is what we are leading into, that as a fiduciary, that we have got to be pricing this stuff in and avoiding some of these things as a long-term investor. And so you're going to see us pushing out more products around this, doing more research around this, really bringing the weight that BlackRock has to bear in international conversations around the theme. So I'm extremely hopeful.
Thank you.
Yeah, same here. I'm extremely optimistic, but I would say that a challenge to all of you who are thinking of issuing or planning to issue a bond, again, you can do it. Sean here is going to be a great help and can advise you. Be transparent, engage with your investors, and it can be done. And I think we can all do our part, and this is our part. Certainly governments and others have their part to do, but I think we can certainly do our part to make this a better place.
Our friends at the Inter-American Development Bank are providing support services. The IFC is providing support services. The World Bank is providing support services. We're doing a project here where climate bonds with our partners E3 and Metrics are providing support services, and working with IFC on a taxonomy for Colombia to make it easy to provide guidance. There's going to be a lot happening, but most importantly, there's going to be a lot of green and sustainable bond issuance happening this year, and that's what will excite markets. Proof that investors will invest. That's what we need, and then we can do more on the back of it. Look, we do have a bit of a problem. It's a bit of a problem. Climate change. Not to mention developing Colombia post-war. Not to mention making sure we bring people out of poverty around the world. There's a lot of things we've got to address. Climate change is the dominant, but not the only one. Climate change is biodiversity, is natural capital, by the way, because we need our ecosystems to be resilient, because they have to survive heat stress, extraordinary changes in the climate. We're lucky. I know it sounds crazy to say that when you face what I'm going to say is a pretty major threat to humanity. We're lucky because we know what the solutions are. It's not actually that complicated. There are a lot of people in this room who know exactly what to do in their areas of expertise. And we're also lucky because we have the money. We have the money. We have the money. We can get deals going. And that's our privilege in this room, to make sure that the deals get going. That's your job. You are so lucky. Thank you for being us. And thank you to our fantastic panel.
Mr. Kidney, Mr. Bastit.